did the Vatican bury the truest story ever told? Imagine a parchment sealed in wax, tucked behind stone for centuries, its ink declaring that the blood of the Messiah did not end on the cross. Imagine a name almost erased a lineage that quietly survived shaping kings and councils, while the world believed it was gone. If even a fragment of that claim proved true, every cathedral fresco and gilded reliquary would tell a different gospel. Tonight, we open the door that was meant to stay shut and ask whether Christ left behind not just words, but heirs. Let the thunder of that question drift away now. The echo softens against the marble vaults. A lantern swings. Dust rises like pale incense. Breathe slower. You're not staring at headlines anymore. You're walking into a hush older than every empire that came and went beneath these stones. For 2 millennia, the story of Jesus has been told as one of sacrifice and transcendence, a divine arc that ends at the tomb and ascends toward heaven. Yet scattered across forgotten monasteries beneath French hillsides, inside the sealed Vatican vaults, linger scraps of rumor about a royal heir who never made it into the canon. Some dismiss these whispers as heresy, others suspect deliberate omission, not out of malice but to guard fragile politics of faith and throne. We're here to follow those trails, to weigh relic against legend, parchment against power. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Now find a comfortable seat, let the noise of the present fall behind, and listen as the first candle of this long-hidden story flickers to life. The first step in untangling any mystery about a hidden bloodline is to ask whether the idea of such an heir was ever truly impossible. The common image of Jesus is a solitary figure, a wandering rabbi with no earthly attachments beyond a few devoted followers. But that image was shaped by centuries of selective storytelling. Long before the first evangelists put quill to parchment, the Jewish world of the Second Temple period was steeped in a vivid expectation that the Messiah would not be merely a teacher of parables or a miracle worker wandering Galilee's shores. He was supposed to be a king, a son of David, an heir in the flesh, whose descendants could inherit both throne and covenant. That prophecy, whispered across generations of rabbis and zealots, is the first crack in the idea that Christ's line ended at the cross. The expectation of a royal Messiah can be traced to passages like 2 Samuel's promise to David that his throne would be established forever, and to Isaiah's vision of a shoot rising from the stump of Jesse. In the first century, these verses were not treated as poetic metaphor. They were political ammunition. Judea groaned under Roman rule, and a lineage claim carried the weight of rebellion. Some historians argue that any man claiming the title Messiah without some genealogical link to David would have been dismissed outright by his contemporaries. This detail alone suggests that Jesus' own family line through Joseph, or perhaps even through Mary, depending on which genealogy you follow, mattered far more to his earliest followers than later theology admits. And here lies the first of many disputes. The Gospel of Matthew presents one genealogy tracing Jesus' ancestry back to David through Joseph, while the Gospel of Luke offers a different lineage that scholars have puzzled over for centuries. The two lists disagree on names after King David and even appear to chart through different sons. Early church fathers tried to harmonize them, claiming one followed a legal line, the other a bloodline. Yet the inconsistency has never been fully settled. Critics see in it either careless editing or a clue that there were once competing traditions about which branch of David's family the Messiah truly sprang from. As you breathe in the candlelit hush of this imagined archive, notice how the ink in these genealogies holds more than theology. It hints at flesh and inheritance. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing for Rome in the same century, remarks on the power of priestly and royal genealogies still being kept in temple records. If such records existed, then somewhere in the rubble of the destroyed Second Temple may have lain the definitive scrolls that once proved or disproved the claims of every would-be savior. Their destruction leaves us leaning on fragments and fuels centuries of speculation that someone somewhere salvaged them. A curious and lesser-known episode emerges from Qumran. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments like the Florilegium speak of a figure called the Branch of David, who would rise in the last days. The Qumran community's obsession with purity of lineage suggests they too anticipated a Messiah whose authority was grounded in birthright as much as in spirit. It is tempting to wonder whether that expectation bled into early Christian storytelling and why later retellings muted it. Scholars debate whether the Qumran texts influenced the Gospel writers directly or merely echoed a cultural undercurrent already alive in Judea. Here we stumble upon our first truly open question. If Jesus was indeed expected by some of his contemporaries to inaugurate a dynastic restoration of David's house, what happened to that dynastic hope after his death? Was it extinguished as Rome crushed revolt after revolt, or was it carried on by disciples who believed the promise still had a literal heir? The disappearance of a royal claimant might explain why the earliest Christian communities turned increasingly toward a purely spiritual interpretation of messiahship, less risky to Rome, easier to preach across the empire. But a spiritual Messiah left a political vacuum, and vacuums rarely stay empty. Now recall that whisper from the opening candlelight, that perhaps a parchment somewhere held the words, "His blood endures." Those words only have power in a world that first believed the Messiah must have descendants. Without that ancient expectation, later rumors about a hidden family would be unthinkable. As we continue deeper into this investigation, that background becomes the foundation on which every other clue rests. You might smile at the irony that centuries of sermons about spiritual redemption were built atop texts whose original audience would have nodded gravely at questions of lineage and dynastic succession. Imagine a Pharisee of the first century hearing that the Messiah had no heirs. He would likely arch an eyebrow and ask how such a figure could fulfill David's covenant at all. That single raised eyebrow, frozen across 2,000 years of theological debate, is what keeps historians awake at night and keeps us turning the next fragile page. The air grows heavier as you follow the flickering candle deeper into the imagined archive. If the prophecies demanded a royal heir, the next natural question is almost embarrassingly human: could the Messiah have taken a wife? In mainstream tradition, the answer has always been no. Yet the earliest centuries of Christian history were not unanimous on this point. Some communities quietly entertained the notion that Jesus' ministry might have included a partner whose role was both personal and symbolic. Over time, that suggestion was treated as scandal, even blasphemy, yet it never completely vanished. One of the most tantalizing fragments comes from a group of second-century believers called the Carpocratians, whose critics accused them of teaching that Jesus had known human intimacy. We know of them only because their opponents wrote polemics against them, which makes the details suspect. But it does prove the idea was already circulating less than 100 years after the crucifixion. Another far less controversial, but still provocative source is the Gospel of Philip, part of the Cache, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. In that text, Mary Magdalene is described not as a repentant sinner, but as Jesus' close companion, one whom he loved more than the other disciples. The text even refers to her as his koinonos, a Greek word that can mean partner or spouse. Scholars argue fiercely over whether that word implies a literal marriage or a metaphorical spiritual union. The canonical Gospels, though less explicit, present Magdalene in an unusually prominent role. She is named among the few who stood near the cross and is recorded as the first witness of the resurrection. Such prominence for a woman in a patriarchal culture raises eyebrows among historians. Some suggest it signals her exceptional status, while traditional commentators frame it as proof of her devotion. The tension between these readings has kept the debate alive through centuries of art and exegesis. Of course, a single obscure phrase in a Gnostic gospel is hardly proof of matrimony. Yet one cannot ignore the pattern in some early communities. Mary Magdalene is not merely an attendant, but a figure of authority. Certain 2nd and 3rd century writings even depict friction between her and Peter, as if her closeness to Jesus challenged the emerging male hierarchy. If such rivalry was real, it would make sense for later Orthodox tradition to minimize her role, transforming her into a penitent sinner rather than a potential matriarch of a holy family. It is worth pausing to note that marriage for a Jewish rabbi of the period would not have been scandalous. Celibacy was rare outside of ascetic sects like the Essenes. Many teachers married, and failure to do so sometimes drew criticism. This cultural fact makes the silence about Jesus' marital status in the canonical Gospels more conspicuous. Was it omitted because it was too mundane to mention, or because it threatened the carefully shaped image of a purely divine Savior? Now think back to the genealogical puzzle we encountered earlier, the two conflicting family trees in Matthew and Luke. If a dynastic heir existed, it could only be traced through a legitimate union, not rumor. That raises an open question. Had a child been born, whose lineage would it claim? Joseph's legal Davidic line, Mary's bloodline, or a combined heritage? The answer would have mattered to anyone seeking a throne in a land where rival claimants traced their rights back to David. Among the more controversial modern discoveries is a fragment unveiled in 2012 by Harvard historian Karen King, dubbed the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. The tiny papyrus scrap includes the phrase, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" Subsequent chemical testing and paleographic analysis produced conflicting results. Some experts considered it an ingenious modern forgery. Others argued for its antiquity, but admitted the text was too fragmentary to be decisive. Whether authentic or fake, the uproar it caused revealed how unsettling the idea remains even after 2,000 years. A lesser-known medieval tradition from Provence in southern France preserved oral tales that Mary Magdalene arrived there by sea after the crucifixion. Those legends will become important when we later trace the supposed journey of a sacred child across the Mediterranean. For now, it is enough to observe that such tales almost always portray her as more than a grieving disciple. She is often depicted carrying something precious, sometimes described as relics, sometimes as a chalice, and occasionally hinted to be a living legacy. Returning to the Vatican's historical stance, the Church never officially declared the question of Jesus' marital status a formal heresy. It simply omitted it from doctrine, favoring the portrayal of Christ as celibate. The absence of a formal decree has allowed scholars to keep revisiting the topic. Each revisit is like brushing dust off a painting, only to discover the original sketch beneath. That sketch depicts a faith in which the sacred was not severed from the human, but intertwined with it. Skeptics often raise a valid objection. If Jesus had married and fathered a child, why did none of his immediate followers write this down plainly? Perhaps they did, and the writings were lost in persecutions or deemed unworthy of inclusion when the Gospels were compiled decades later. Perhaps it was so ordinary among his contemporaries that it needed no comment, much like mentioning that someone eats bread. The absence of evidence here is a hollow that invites speculation, and it is within such hollows that legends take root. The suggestion of a hidden marriage may seem at first like a modern novelist's trope, But as the candlelight lingers on the cracked edges of ancient papyrus, you realize the idea has lived for centuries just beneath the surface. It has survived councils, crusades, and inquisitions carried in the margins of texts and the memory of remote communities. Whether it is myth or memory remains the question, but it is a question that refuses to die. You may even catch yourself smiling at the cosmic humor in all this, that 2,000 years of theological disputes might hinge on the possibility that a traveling preacher simply followed the normal custom of his time and wed. Imagine how disappointed scandal seekers would be if the great revelation were that he merely had an ordinary family life. Still, ordinary lives can give rise to extraordinary legacies, and if any legacy endured beyond Golgotha, it would change everything about how we understand the rise of early Christianity. The whispers of a union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene linger like incense after Vespers, faint but persistent, clinging to every tapestry that dares to place them side by side. Those whispers set the stage for the next step in our investigation, the rumor that she fled the Holy Land not alone, but carrying more than grief across the sea. Picture the coastline of the first-century Mediterranean restless and silver beneath the moon, fishing boats creaking against the tide. In the legends of southern France, one such boat carried a passenger whose name had already become a prayer and a scandal, Mary Magdalene. The story goes that she arrived not as a fugitive monk clutching relics, but as a woman exiled by circumstance stepping ashore at Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, where the Camargue marshland meets the sea. Though historians regard this account as folklore, it is a remarkably enduring one, first recorded in medieval hagiographies and still celebrated every May with processions that carry her effigy to the water's edge. To understand why this flight to Gaul matters to our inquiry, recall the earlier whispers of a hidden marriage. If there had been an heir to a Davidic messianic line, it would have needed safety somewhere beyond the reach of Roman authorities and local collaborators. Gaul, under Roman rule, distant from Jerusalem's turbulent politics, offered such a refuge. French tradition tells of Magdalene accompanied by a small band, Martha Lazarus, a servant named Sarah, sometimes even a child whose identity was never clarified. The presence of that unnamed child haunts the legend, like a watermark, faint yet suggestive. A well-established historical fact lends a thin layer of plausibility to this tale by the first-century Jewish communities already lived along the Mediterranean coast of Gaul, particularly in Marseille and Narbonne. Ancient trade routes tied these ports to Alexandria and the Levant, so a refugee's arrival by sea was not unimaginable. Archaeological evidence confirms that synagogues and Hebrew inscriptions existed in the region long before Christianity became dominant. Thus, the setting of the legend is at least historically credible. The earliest written form of the story appears in the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend, compiled in the 13th century by Jacobus de Voragine. It depicts Magdalene spending her later years in prayer and penance in a cave at Saint-Baume. The cave still draws pilgrims today. Though the narrative is drenched in medieval piety, some researchers note that such local cults often preserved older oral traditions. Could it be that a memory of a real arrival, however altered by time, survived in popular devotion long after official history forgot it? An obscure yet intriguing detail lies in a 9th-century monastic chronicle from Vézelay Abbey, which claimed to hold Magdalene's relics. The monks there recorded a tradition that her relics had been secretly transferred to them to protect them from Saracen raids. While relic commerce was rampant in the Middle Ages, the insistence on secrecy fuels speculation about what was being hidden: bones of a saint or evidence of a different kind of legacy altogether. Modern historians remain divided. Some argue that the flight narrative was a medieval invention to enhance the prestige of French shrines and draw pilgrims. Others believe that while the details grew legendary, the core story of a Levantine Christian woman or group arriving by boat may reflect an authentic migration following the Jewish-Roman conflicts. This scholarly debate underscores the challenge we face sifting through layers of faith-driven embellishment to glimpse possible kernels of fact. As you follow the thread of the legend further inland, you encounter the figure of Saint Sarah Lacali, revered by the Romani people as their patron saint. Tradition casts her as a dark-skinned servant who accompanied Magdalene's party. The blending of Sarah into the tale illustrates how folk memory and local identities wove themselves into the larger story, each community claiming a strand of the arrival to make it their own. Whether Sarah was an historic companion or a later symbolic addition is unknown, but her presence reinforces the idea that the voyage's company may have been larger than a lone, grieving disciple. Consider again the callback to our opening chapter's theme, the notion that Christ's bloodline could have endured only if protected. If a child had indeed been born of Magdalene, and Jesus transporting that child westward would have been a desperate yet logical strategy. Rome's suppression of Judean revolts grew harsher after the crucifixion, and Herodian politics remained volatile. A child with even a rumored claim to Davidic kingship would have been vulnerable. Gaul's distance, its existing Jewish diaspora, and its relative obscurity in imperial politics made it an appealing haven. A particularly controversial interpretation arises from the writings of the 19th century scholar Louis Martin, who proposed that the cult of Saint Anne in Brittany hinted at a veneration of the maternal line of a holy dynasty. His theory, largely dismissed by mainstream academia, nonetheless illustrates how local traditions in France often enshrouded figures of revered women tied to biblical memory, lending fuel to the speculation that the Magdalene brought with her more than just relics. The open question remains stark if Magdalene's journey to Gaul was merely pious legend. How did it endure so vividly across centuries, influencing local festivals, place names, and even coats of arms in Provence? And if there was indeed a journey, what cargo was worth such tenacious secrecy? The absence of any contemporary Roman or Jewish record of her voyage leaves historians skeptical. Yet the sheer persistence of the tradition across disparate sources suggests that someone may once have come ashore. Pausing for a moment in this imagined candlelit archive, you might find a touch of wry amusement at how an entire continental mystery can hinge on the unrecorded passenger list of a single boat. It is almost absurdly mundane, like misplacing a customs ledger that happened to contain the most explosive genealogy in religious history. Yet history is littered with such lost ledgers, and sometimes the legends that replace them carry more truth than we expect. The legend of the Magdalene's flight to Gaul sets the scene for the emergence of dynasties that would later claim sacred heritage. To follow that path, we must next examine the rise of the Merovingians, whose claim to royal blood, the sang real, transformed these coastal legends into a political weapon that shaped medieval Europe. By the time you step into the dim corridors of early medieval Europe, the Mediterranean legend of Magdalene's voyage has drifted inland, braided into dynastic ambition. The Merovingians, who ruled large swaths of Frankish territory from the 5th to the 8th century, became the first royal house of Europe to be whispered about as more than merely Germanic conquerors. They were called the long-haired kings, famed for their flowing locks that symbolized sacred authority, and for reasons still debated, their ancestry attracted rumors that reached far beyond the Rhine and Seine. One well-established fact about the Merovingians is their chronicled descent from a chieftain named Merovech, whose line united rival Frankish tribes. Yet even in the earliest chronicles, like those of Gregory of Tours, the origins of Merovech's bloodline are cloaked in ambiguity. Gregory records a legend that Merovech's mother encountered a strange sea creature while already pregnant by her human husband, and thus conceived a son marked by dual parentage. Medieval scribes preserved this story not as literal zoology, but as a sign of supernatural election. Over centuries, that myth of otherworldly lineage created fertile soil for the later grafting of a more audacious claim that the dynasty's true distinction lay not in fable, but in a sacred Semitic bloodline that had quietly taken root in Gaul centuries earlier. The phrase sang real first appears in medieval Romance literature as a poetic reference to the Holy Grail. In Old French, it could mean either Holy Grail or, when divided differently, royal blood. That linguistic ambiguity later inspired the controversial notion that the Grail legend was never about a chalice at all, but about a bloodline. This interpretation owes much to modern writers of the 20th century. Yet it rests on a kernel of medieval symbolism in which vessels, lineage, and covenant were often interchangeable metaphors. A more obscure historical detail surfaces in the chronicles of the Carolingians, the dynasty that succeeded the Merovingians. To justify their takeover, Carolingian propagandists emphasized Merovingian weakness, describing the later kings as shadow rulers dominated by their mayors of the palace. Intriguingly, they also portrayed the Merovingian line as possessing a mystique that still commanded popular reverence, even when its political power waned. That lingering reverence hints that the dynasty's claim to sanctity was not merely political propaganda, but rooted in deeper cultural memory, perhaps tied to the earlier Magdalene legends, flourishing in Provence and Languedoc. Modern researchers who chase the notion of a messianic descent often point to the marriage alliances that linked Merovingian heirs with noble families of Septimania, a region that overlapped with historical centers of Jewish and Visigothic settlement. The historical fact of these alliances is documented in charters and genealogies, though the idea that they served to preserve a Davidic Magdalene lineage remains speculative. Critics dismiss it as retrofitted genealogy invented by later secret society myths. Supporters counter that dynastic marriages in the early medieval period were rarely random and often carried ancient prestige claims. Remember how, in the previous candlelit chapter, we traced Magdalene's alleged landing on the French coast. The Frankish heartland into which the Merovingians rose lay a few hundred miles north, but pilgrim routes and monastic networks between Provence and the Loire ensured the Magdalene cult's influence spread widely by the 6th century. Reliquaries said to hold her hair or bones were paraded before kings. If a royal house sought to legitimize itself as chosen by God, no connection would be more advantageous than to link its line by relic rumor or marriage to the companion of Christ. An open question troubles historians: why did so many medieval chroniclers take care to emphasize the Merovingians' unique blood, yet never specify what made it unique? Some speculate that the mystery was useful in itself, a political aura that discouraged rebellion. Others suggest the dynasty's long-haired kingship and semi-sacred burial rites in stone sarcophagi borrowed from Roman Christian customs were enough to inspire myth without any hidden genealogy. Yet the silence leaves a vacuum into which the sang real interpretation has poured. You might sense a wry smile tugging at the corners of this investigation, that a pun in Old French could ignite centuries of treasure hunters' quests and Vatican cover-up theories. Still, linguistic accidents often open doors to reinterpretation. Had medieval poets not played so freely with homonyms, perhaps the bloodline theory would have remained buried under the stones of Merovingian basilicas. A striking, if little-known discovery from the mid-20th century came from excavations at the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris burial site of many Merovingian kings. Archaeologists noted the unusual combination of pagan-style grave goods with Christian symbols reinforcing the dynasty's liminal identity between old tribal rites and new sacred monarchy. While these finds say nothing about Semitic descent, they show how the Merovingians cultivated a mystique of antiquity distinct from their Carolingian successors, perhaps perpetuating stories of a lineage set apart from ordinary Franks. This entire thread loops us back to the core theme of the Messiah's supposed bloodline. If Magdalene did arrive in Gaul carrying a child of sacred descent, one could imagine that over generations, the line intermarried into local nobility, eventually rising to Frankish royalty. No contemporary document proves it, but the convergence of Magdalene veneration in southern Gaul with a dynasty obsessed with its own peculiar heritage is difficult to ignore. As you trace your fingertips across the damp stone walls of this imagined archive, you might think of how dynastic myths often outlast the kingdoms they justify. The Merovingians fell to palace coups and papal politics, yet their rumored sang rail survives in literature heraldry, and even in the claims of modern genealogists, who hunt for a lost thread of Semitic DNA in European aristocracy. Whether fact or fiction, the Merovingian story transformed a regional saint's legend into a weapon of legitimacy, setting the stage for future conflicts over who truly bore the mark of divine right. The sang-real question leads us next to the texts that may once have chronicled an unbroken lineage of Nazarenes, but disappeared from the official canon writings, whose absence may be as telling as their words would have been. The candlelight trembles as though stirred by an unseen breath throwing uneven shadows on the rows of imagined manuscripts. Among these spectral shelves lies a book that has never been found intact yet, whose title echoes in early commentaries the Gospel of the Nazarenes. If it existed in full, it might have preserved the most tantalizing evidence of all genealogies and stories of Jesus that diverged from the versions endorsed by Rome. We know of this gospel not from its own pages, but from fragments and citations scattered like breadcrumbs across writings of the early church fathers. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, mentioned consulting a Hebrew gospel according to the Nazarenes, claiming it was similar to the Gospel of Matthew, but not identical. He even cited a few verses that differ from the canonical text. One such passage describes Jesus saying that the Holy Spirit had recently taken the form of his mother. Another includes a different wording of the Lord's Prayer. These hints suggest a text shaped by Jewish Christian communities that clung to older traditions, often sidelined by Gentile converts. The historical fact we can affirm is that various Jewish Christian sects, Nazarenes, Ebionites, Elkosites, flourished in the first few centuries after the crucifixion. They tended to honor the Mosaic law and to regard Jesus as a chosen prophet or Messiah within Israel's covenant, rather than as a fully divine figure detached from human lineage. Such a perspective might naturally have given weight to the preservation of his earthly genealogy. Unfortunately, as Orthodox Christianity expanded under imperial patronage, these sects dwindled their writings, condemned as heretical or simply neglected, until they vanished. An obscure detail often overlooked lies in a comment by Epiphanius of Salamis, a 4th century bishop known for cataloging heresies. In describing the Nazarenes, he noted they used a gospel in Hebrew script that lacked the infancy narratives found in Matthew and Luke. If true, that omission could suggest a version of the Jesus story, less concerned with miraculous virgin birth and more focused on his adult life, a subtle but significant shift that may have allowed for a more human dynastic interpretation of the Messiah. The fact that such a text once circulated challenges the assumption that the canonical narratives were the only ones available to the earliest believers. The open question, of course, is what else the Gospel of the Nazarenes might have contained. Could it have preserved a family record tracing Jesus more explicitly to the house of David? Did it perhaps recount episodes of his domestic life now lost to history? We cannot know. Every scholar who has pursued the trail admits that only a handful of quotations survive, mostly theological in nature, not genealogical. Yet absence can be as haunting as presence of vanished gospel associated with a community that valued the Messiah's Jewish heritage is exactly the sort of source one might expect to mention a bloodline, if it existed. This line of inquiry connects naturally back to the Merovingian intrigue. If a sacred lineage did take root in Gaul, it must have passed through centuries when Christianity itself was still negotiating the boundaries of its own story. Imagine the importance such a gospel would have had for medieval dynasties seeking legitimacy. A scroll quoting Jesus' lineage in earthy, unbroken terms could have been more powerful than any relic. That possibility fuels speculation that fragments of the Nazarene's writings or copies thereof may have been hoarded by sects like the Cathars, or later by the Knights Templar, both of whom were accused of heresies that unsettled Rome. Now picture Jerome in his scriptorium candles guttering while he translated Hebrew manuscripts into the Latin Vulgate. Did he pause at any line that hinted at a more human legacy for Christ? Hesitate, then decide it was best left untranslated. There is no record of such censorship, but the mere suggestion reveals how vulnerable texts were to the choices of their copyists. A scribe's decision of what to copy, what to summarize, what to omit, could alter the trajectory of a millennium of belief. Humor sometimes sneaks in, even among ancient parchments. One medieval commentator once complained that the so-called heretical Gospels were often so poorly preserved, they were like patchwork quilts stitched from half-remembered verses. You can almost picture him sighing over ink-blotted scrolls, unaware that future generations would mourn those very fragments as priceless historical losses. The Nazarene's vanished text leaves us suspended between scholarship and rumor. Was it simply an early draft of Matthew later discarded, or a rival witness to events that others preferred to silence? Its ghostly presence in the record is a reminder that history is shaped as much by what is lost as by what survives. This gap in the manuscript trail keeps alive the hope that somewhere, perhaps deep in a Vatican vault or buried beneath desert sands, a more complete copy waits to be rediscovered. As the candlelight pools across these phantom pages, you may find yourself thinking back to the fragile genealogies in Matthew and Luke and the whispered marriage of Magdalene. Each puzzle piece points toward the same question: what stories about Jesus' humanity were trimmed away to fit the framework of later theology? To answer that, we turn next to the Gnostic writings discovered in the 20th century, whose cryptic verses continue to challenge the official narrative and to hint ever so obliquely at a lineage that might once have walked beside the apostles. The atmosphere of the imagined archive deepens as you move toward a glass case holding scraps of parchment that changed 20th century scholarship, the Nag Hammadi codices. Discovered in 1945 by farmers digging for fertilizer near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, these 13 leather-bound books preserved over 50 previously lost texts of early Christian and Gnostic communities. Their survival is one of history's stranger accidents. The manuscripts had been hidden in a sealed jar since late antiquity, likely to protect them from destruction during waves of orthodoxy-enforced purges. Their recovery nearly 2 millennia later pulled open a door to forgotten theological debates, and for our investigation, they offer tantalizing whispers about the human relationships of the Messiah. A solid historical fact anchors their importance. Many of these texts were composed between the 2nd and 4th centuries, placing them close enough to the earliest generations of Christians to preserve alternative memories. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary stand out as voices that differ markedly from the 4 canonical accounts. They depict a Jesus who speaks in riddles, emphasizes inner knowledge over ritual law, and sometimes grants Mary Magdalene unusual prominence. One obscure but riveting line comes from the Gospel of Philip, which states that the companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. But Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the... The manuscript breaks off there a cruel tear in the papyrus that has launched 1,000 speculations. Some scholars insist the word following kiss her on the wa's mouth, citing surviving traces of the letter mu, while others argue it could have been hand or cheek. The ambiguity illustrates how a single lost syllable can tilt the weight of an entire theory. Either way, the passage portrays an intimacy that seems out of step with the aloof celibate figure favored by later orthodoxy. Another intriguing detail appears in the Pistis Sophia, a 3rd-century Gnostic text, preserved in Coptic, where Mary Magdalene emerges repeatedly as a chief interlocutor of Jesus, posing more questions than any other disciple and receiving elaborate answers. The text hints at her possessing special insight, sparking jealousy from Peter, who complains about her prominence. While not genealogical evidence, these portrayals raise the question of why a woman received such focus if she were merely an incidental follower. Here lies the open scholarly debate: are these Gnostic depictions of Mary and Jesus a window onto historical memories suppressed by orthodoxy, or purely symbolic stories reflecting the movement's mystical ideals? Mainstream historians lean toward the latter, viewing the texts as theological allegories with no intention of describing literal events. Yet the consistent theme of Magdalene's closeness to Jesus across multiple non-canonical sources invites curiosity. Why would communities across Egypt and Syria venerate her as a figure of special authority unless a memory of unusual status lingered in oral tradition? Think back to the previous discussion of the lost Gospel of the Nazarenes. That fragmentary Hebrew text appeared to value Jesus' Jewish heritage and may have preserved a more human portrait of him. The Gnostic writings, though theologically distinct, share a fascination with recentering figures marginalized by the emerging Orthodox narrative, particularly women and alternative apostles. Together, these two streams suggest that the canonical Gospels represent not the whole story, but the winning faction's version. If anything about a holy bloodline had ever been preserved in writing, these rival texts would have been natural places to look. Modern geneticists obviously cannot test ideas derived from mystical poetry, yet historians examining power struggles in the early church note that any hint of Jesus leaving an earthly heir would have threatened the authority of bishops who claimed spiritual succession through Peter. By removing lineage from the story, the hierarchy could assert control over the faithful unchallenged by any rival hereditary claim. This perspective adds a political motive for why texts emphasizing Magdalene's closeness to Jesus might have been discouraged or condemned. There is even a wry bit of scholarly humor in how these debates unfold. Conferences on Gnostic literature sometimes resemble courtroom dramas, with papyrologists squinting at half-erased ink marks under infrared light, while theologians argue over whether the early church silenced not merely rival doctrines, but potentially rival heirs. You can almost picture the ghost of an ancient scribe sighing in the back row, muttering that he only meant to copy down a sermon, not ignite centuries of conspiracy theories. The Gnostic texts do not offer a tidy genealogical chart or birth record, yet they amplify a recurring theme that the Messiah's humanity and his bond with Mary Magdalene were more pronounced in some circles than the sanitized imperial version would later admit. That resonance draws a faint line back to the legends of a journey to Gaul, carrying something more precious than relics. Although no papyrus has yet surfaced to prove a bloodline, the fragments suggest that alternative memories once circulated freely enough to require suppression. As you let your eyes rest on the fragile Coptic letters, it is tempting to imagine a complete lost codex, still sealed in a jar beneath desert sands, that could clarify once and for all whether these intimations were purely symbolic or glimpses of a family narrative erased for theological convenience. Until such a discovery, the Gnostic chorus remains an echo in the archive, an echo that leads us naturally to examine the institutional response that worked so diligently to erase divergent voices from the record, the edicts of the Vatican, and the machinery of suppression that followed. The candle burns lower as the scent of melting wax mingles with the weight of centuries. At this point in the journey, you have met the scattered witnesses who remembered a more human Messiah, the Nazarenes, with their Hebrew gospel, the Gnostic circles, who granted Magdalene unusual prominence. Now the narrative tightens around the power that eventually defined Orthodoxy, the Church of Rome, whose councils and decrees shaped the boundaries of acceptable memory. To understand how any trace of a supposed holy bloodline might have been lost, we must examine not merely the passage of time, but the deliberate chiseling away of inconvenient stories. One historical fact is beyond dispute: by the 4th century, Christianity had shifted from a persecuted sect to an imperially endorsed religion under Constantine. With power came the need for uniformity, and with uniformity came censorship. Councils such as Nicaea in 325, followed by subsequent synods and papal letters, worked to define what counted as legitimate scripture and what was to be cast aside as heresy. Though the Council of Nicaea itself focused on Christ's nature rather than the canon of the Bible, the atmosphere it inaugurated encouraged later bishops to suppress texts and practices that contradicted the growing consensus. A particularly telling example arises in the writings of Pope Damasus I in the late 4th century. His commissioning of Jerome to produce a standard Latin Bible, the Vulgate, effectively marginalized local Gospels in Hebrew or Syriac, still circulating among Jewish Christian groups. The move was practical for unifying the liturgy of the Western Church, yet it also ensured that any variant genealogies or domestic details contained in those other texts would fade from public use. An obscure but revealing incident surfaces in the 6th century, when Pope Gelasius issued a decree listing prohibited books known as the Decretum Galasianum. This catalog condemned several apocryphal Gospels and acts, some of which were rumored to contain unorthodox portraits of Jesus' life. Although scholars debate whether Gelasius personally authored the list or inherited it from earlier councils, its influence endured. Manuscripts so named were less likely to be copied, accelerating their disappearance. The open question that continues to animate researchers is whether these decrees were motivated purely by doctrinal clarity, or whether some of the targeted texts contained traditions that threatened the institutional power structure. For example, stories emphasizing a hereditary messianic line that could rival the spiritual authority claimed by bishops and popes. While no surviving decree explicitly mentions suppressing a bloodline narrative, the broad sweep with which alternative stories were branded heretical leaves room for suspicion. Here we circle back to the genealogical tensions discussed in our earliest candlelit chapter. The canonical Gospels preserved 2 inconsistent family trees for Jesus, yet never elaborated on what became of his siblings or extended kin beyond a few passing references. Early Christian historian Hegesippus, writing in the 2nd century, mentioned relatives of Jesus known as the Desposini, literally those belonging to the Lord. He recorded that 2 grandsons of Jude, the Lord's brother, were summoned before Emperor Domitian as potential political threats because of their Davidic lineage. This is a verifiable historical note. Roman authorities once viewed Jesus' family as carrying dynastic significance. Yet later, church tradition quietly minimized the Desposini's role, focusing instead on apostolic succession. The Desposini episode underscores a critical irony. Roman bureaucrats recognized what later theologians preferred to ignore: that claims of Davidic blood could inspire revolt or legitimacy in a volatile province. If even distant cousins of Jesus drew imperial scrutiny, one can imagine why stories of a direct descendant through Magdalene, had any evidence existed, would have been deemed explosive and suppressed with zeal. A wry aside might be forgiven here. Bureaucratic lists have always been humanity's favorite tool for controlling memory, whether imperial edicts or modern corporate emails marked "confidential, do not share." The Gelasian decree was simply a 4th century version of hitting delete, except the files were manuscripts copied by hand, and deletion meant the slow starvation of entire traditions. Consider also the role of the Inquisition in later centuries. Established formally in the 13th century to combat Cathar and other heresies, it targeted groups accused of holding secret doctrines. Among the charges, sometimes whispered, though rarely documented in official records, were rumors that these sects preserved alternative gospels or genealogies that undermined papal authority. While historians find no conclusive proof that the Inquisition hunted a messianic bloodline theory, specifically its fervor in seizing and burning suspect manuscripts ensured that if such records ever did exist, their survival was improbable. Looking back at the previous exploration of Gnostic texts, one sees how consistently the patterns of suppression appear a central authority, striving to standardize belief for the sake of unity, collateral damage being the erasure of stories that highlighted Jesus' earthly ties. This recurring motif strengthens the plausibility, though not the proof, that any narrative hinting at a living bloodline would have been among the first casualties of doctrinal consolidation. Imagine standing in the Vatican library today before shelves where chained folios whisper with the rustle of pages rarely turned. The atmosphere is more academic than conspiratorial, yet researchers often speak of catalogs marked sub secreto items restricted from general access. Most such restrictions are mundane, concerning fragile condition or diplomatic archives. Still, the legend persists that hidden among them lie texts too disruptive to release their contents, known only to a handful of curators. The lack of transparency itself feeds speculation more effectively than any forged parchment ever could. You may chuckle softly at the thought that 2,000 years of grand conspiracy theories might owe their endurance to nothing more than librarians obeying preservation protocols and scholars refusing to admit they sometimes just lose track of things. Yet whether by deliberate design or by the entropy of history, what was left outside the canon, especially anything implying heirs of Christ, has remained elusive. This chapter of edicts and erasures prepares the ground for one of the most persistent rumors in medieval lore, that an order of warrior monks rose to protect secrets too dangerous for papal vaults. If the Vatican's pen struck lines through unwanted stories, the sword of the Knights Templar, some claim, stood guard over what survived. The flicker of torchlight against steel hauberks replaces the quiet glow of parchment now, as our focus shifts from scribes in cloisters to warriors sworn to both sword and cross. Founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar, grew from a handful of men stationed near the ruins of the Jerusalem Temple into one of the most powerful institutions of the medieval world. Their rise is well-documented papal endorsements, vast landholdings, their role as bankers for crusading Europe. Yet alongside these public achievements, sprouted rumors that they had uncovered something beneath the Temple Mount that elevated them from mere knights to guardians of forbidden knowledge. A historical fact anchors these whispers. For nearly a decade after their founding, the early Templars lodged in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built atop what many believed to be the site of Solomon's Temple. Chroniclers like William of Tyre record that during those years, the knights engaged in little visible military action, leading later historians and treasure hunters to suspect that they spent their time excavating the foundations beneath the sacred mount. Archaeological evidence is inconclusive, but in the late 19th and 20th centuries, explorers uncovered ancient tunnels and cisterns beneath the area, lending credibility to the idea that the ground itself held secrets. One obscure and tantalizing clue surfaces in a letter attributed to the 12th century chronicler Theodoric of Würzburg, who described the Templars discovering subterranean halls and strange relics during repairs to their quarters. The letter's authenticity is debated, and mainstream scholars caution that it may be a later forgery crafted to fuel romantic legends. Still, the detail persists in Templar lore and inspires speculation that the knights might have recovered scrolls or artifacts linked to the lineage of David, the very records that Roman destruction of the Second Temple had supposedly erased. The open question that fascinates both academic historians and imaginative novelists is what, if anything, the Templars could have found that so threatened later authorities. Some suggest the Ark of the Covenant or temple treasure. Others whisper of genealogical documents that connected the bloodline of Christ to noble families in the West. No contemporary Templar archive confirms such discoveries, yet the order's meteoric rise in wealth and influence, combined with their unique exemption from local laws answering only to the Pope, has been cited as circumstantial evidence that they possessed leverage beyond mere military prowess. Connecting back to our earlier chapters on the Vatican's edicts of erasure, consider the political tension that would arise if an independent military order held proof contradicting Rome's carefully curated theology. A relic demonstrating that Jesus left heirs would have undermined the Church's claim that spiritual succession through Peter alone defined Christian authority. While there is no documented papal confession of such a motive, the Templars' later persecution suggests that fear of their secrets, real or imagined, played a role. The fall of the order is itself a verifiable historical drama. In 1307, on Friday the 13th of October, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of Templar knights, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and illicit rituals. Under torture, many confessed to charges that most historians today dismiss as coerced fabrications, spitting on the cross, idol worship, obscene initiations. Yet among the more quietly circulated accusations was that they possessed writings heretical to church teaching. The precise content of those alleged texts was never revealed during the trials, leaving an empty space that conspiracy theorists eagerly filled with whispers of Magdalene's descendants and hidden gospels. A subtle but telling historical detail often overlooked is that Pope Clement V, initially hesitant to condemn the order, eventually dissolved it under immense pressure from Philip IV. If the Templars merely threatened the French king's finances, why did the papacy comply so completely? Some scholars argue it was political expedience. The Pope owed his position to Philip's influence. Others see in the affair an opportunity to eradicate a rival power center, whose loyalties and knowledge might have become inconvenient. You might allow yourself a brief wry smile, imagining the scene: armored knights dragging dusty scrolls out of subterranean tunnels, then centuries later, becoming the subject of mystery novels and video game quests. It seems almost unfair to the historical soldiers, who likely spent most of their careers guarding caravan routes. Yet history is often cruelly indifferent to the mundane, remembering only the rumor. Whatever the truth of their supposed discoveries, the Templars left a legacy of enigma. After their dissolution, their properties were seized, their leaders executed or imprisoned, and their archives scattered or lost. That archival disappearance, whether due to deliberate destruction or bureaucratic neglect, ensured that if they ever did preserve records of a holy lineage, such evidence would be as elusive as the Sang Real itself. This lingering uncertainty forms a bridge to our next pursuit: the material remnants carried back to Europe during the Crusades, relics and reliquaries, whose provenance sometimes hints at a Levantine origin older than the knights themselves. These artifacts, once displayed in cathedrals or hoarded in noble treasuries, have stories to tell if only we can separate genuine history from the shimmer of legend. The clink of iron-shod boots fades, replaced by the hush of candle-lit chapels where glass-fronted reliquaries glow like captive embers. As the Crusades waned, Europe's churches and noble treasuries filled with objects carried home from the Levant slivers of the true cross scraps of linen, claimed as shrouds bones of saints and stranger things, whose origins no one could quite agree upon. These artifacts did more than adorn altars. They shaped local legends, bolstered dynastic prestige, and sometimes stirred suspicions that among them lay evidence of stories the Church preferred to leave unspoken. A historical fact frames this period. During the 12th and 13th centuries. An organized trade in relics flourished. Pilgrims, knights, and merchants transported pieces of sacred matter across the Mediterranean. Inventories kept by abbeys such as Cluny, Saint-Denis, and Chartres list hundreds of items attributed to biblical figures. While most were undoubtedly spurious, a few were traced to documented excavations in the Holy Land, supervised by Crusader lords. Such provenance lent them an air of credibility that fueled both devotion and rumor. One particularly obscure yet tantalizing case centers on a set of lead seals unearthed near Acre in the late 12th century. These seals bore inscriptions in a mixture of Greek and a now-eroded Semitic script, accompanied by a six-pointed star within a chalice-like frame. The seals were reportedly shipped to a monastery in Burgundy, but disappeared from record during the French Wars of Religion. 19th-century antiquarians who claimed to have seen sketches of them believed they were connected to a forgotten Levantine brotherhood that preserved genealogical records. Mainstream scholars regard these claims with skepticism, yet the recurring motif of a chalice framing a star has tempted later writers to link it with the Sang-Riel legend. An open debate persists over the authenticity of several ossuaries that surfaced during Crusader excavations in Jerusalem and Caesarea. Medieval chronicles mention the discovery of limestone boxes engraved with names common in the Second Temple period, Yeshua, Miriam, Yosef. While these were likely unrelated to the gospel figures, chroniclers sometimes described them in reverent tones, as if convinced of a direct biblical connection. The loss or destruction of most of these ossuaries over centuries leaves archaeologists unable to confirm or deny their significance. Think back to the Knights Templar and the aura of secrecy surrounding their years under the Temple Mount. The idea that relics were not just souvenirs, but carriers of hidden knowledge takes on added weight in that context. Crusaders believed that possessing an object from Jerusalem granted not only prestige, but also a spiritual link to the earliest church, and perhaps in whispered circles to the Holy Family itself. The possibility that a reliquary might contain a genealogical scroll, a lock of hair, or a bone believed to be from a descendant of David would have been incendiary in a Europe ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction. A more verifiable instance of relic-linked power occurred when Baldwin III, the first Crusader king of Jerusalem, gifted fragments of what he believed to be the true cross to European allies. These fragments were paraded before armies as talismans of victory. Though unrelated to bloodline mysteries, this practice demonstrates the political potency of relics, a potency that could be magnified if an artifact were rumored to prove dynastic descent from Christ. You may allow yourself a soft laugh at the image of medieval customs officers, if any existed, trying to catalog a cartload of splinters and bones, each with a backstory promising miracles or dynastic upheaval. Paperwork alone would have required divine intervention. Another curious detail surfaces in accounts of the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, when Western forces looted the Byzantine capital's churches and treasuries. Among the haul described by chroniclers were relics tied to John the Baptist Mary, the mother of Jesus, and even objects claimed to be from the line of King David. Most were distributed among Western cathedrals, yet some vanished into private collections of nobles who saw in them more than spiritual comfort, perhaps a token of legitimacy, a fragment of a sacred lineage to display in their family chapels. The scholarly debate over these relics' authenticity continues to this day. Archaeologists demand material proof, radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic evidence, DNA analysis where feasible. Devotees counter that the power of a relic resides in faith and tradition, not laboratory tests. For our investigation, the significance lies less in whether each artifact was genuine, and more in the historical pattern they reveal. Medieval Europe craved tangible links to the holy narrative, and some of those links were rumored to carry genealogical meaning. This craving ties us back to earlier chapters, the Magdalene legend in Gaul, the Sang Real of the Merovingians, the lost Gospels hinting at a human lineage. The relics that arrived from the Levant were not mere curios. They were pieces of a larger cultural mosaic that longed to bridge heaven and earth through blood and bone. If even one object among thousands hinted at a continuation of the Messiah's line, its discovery would have had the power to unsettle both throne and altar. The trail of relics ultimately leads us to a far later mystery, one rooted not in crusader ports, but in a quiet French hill town where a parish priest's sudden wealth and whispered discoveries ignited a century of speculation, the enigma of Rennes-le-Château. Dawn breaks over the mist-draped hills of southern France, a pale wash of gold on rugged stone churches and terraced vineyards. It is in this landscape, remote, sun-scorched in summer, silent in winter, that a small parish village, Rennes-le-Château, became the unlikely epicenter of modern whispers about the bloodline of Christ. The story begins not in antiquity, but in the late 19th century, when a country priest named Béranger Saunière arrived to serve a dwindling rural flock. Within a few years, the humble curé had somehow transformed his crumbling hilltop church and parsonage into a lavish estate, with ornate gardens, imported marble, and towers overlooking the Aude Valley. The historical fact that grounds this tale is simple: Saunière's sudden wealth was real. Parish records and municipal ledgers confirm that between 1891 and 1910 he spent sums far beyond his official stipend. Renovations of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene revealed peculiar choices, bas-reliefs depicting demons, Latin inscriptions of ambiguous translation, and statues arranged in patterns that seemed to hint at hidden meanings. These features caught the attention of locals and decades later of treasure hunters and writers who saw in them the footprint of a concealed inheritance. One obscure but significant detail often overlooked is that during the first phase of renovations, Saunière ordered the excavation of the church floor near the altar. Workmen reportedly uncovered hollow spaces containing ossuaries and crumbling parchments sealed in glass tubes. Contemporary accounts from his housekeeper, Marie Denarnaud, suggest he spent nights poring over these finds before embarking on unexplained trips to Paris. While no surviving document verifies the nature of those parchments, the episode is attested by multiple villagers, whose testimonies were later collected by local historians. The open question that has driven speculation ever since is, what exactly did the priest discover under that old Magdalene-dedicated church? Some believe it was merely medieval family records, or Visigothic treasure perhaps linked to the pillaged riches of nearby Carcassonne. Others argue it was something far more incendiary, a genealogical scroll connecting the village's region to the line of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, a theory fueled by the church's very dedication to Magdalene herself. Connecting back to our earlier candle-lit explorations of Gaul's Magdalene legends, remember that the Languedoc region had for centuries cultivated shrines and festivals venerating her arrival. If any enclave of southern France were to harbor relics or records tied to her legacy, Rennes-le-Château would have been a plausible candidate. This cultural memory provided fertile ground for 20th-century authors like Gérard de Sède, whose 1967 book, L'Or de Rennes, popularized the claim that Saunière had stumbled upon proof of a living bloodline. Skeptical historians point out that Saunière's enrichment could be explained by the more mundane, if illicit, practice of trafficking in paid masses, accepting donations from across France. To say prayers for the dead, a lucrative sideline technically forbidden by church regulations. Archival evidence supports this charge, yet it does not explain the odd iconography or the persistent rumors about coded parchments taken to Paris. A wry moment of levity often shared among researchers is the image of Saunière trudging into the Louvre or the National Library with dusty tubes under his arm, hoping to decode secrets older than Charlemagne, while the Parisian clerks assumed he was just another provincial priest running errands. The contrast between the legend's grandeur and the banality of bureaucracy is almost cinematic. Whether or not Saunière ever held a parchment that traced a sacred genealogy, his church's Magdalene imagery and the mysterious expenditures have linked Rennes-le-Château to the Sang Réal narrative in popular imagination. Treasure maps, encrypted inscriptions on gravestones, and even the peculiar placement of garden statues have been interpreted often fancifully as references to a hidden tomb or a dynastic cache beneath the hill. Modern archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have found anomalies under portions of the churchyard, but nothing that can be publicly confirmed as crypts or vaults. Local authorities wary of looters and lawsuits restrict excavations. This restraint perpetuates the enigma for an unexcavated site, allows legend to breathe freely. This French hilltop mystery serves as a bridge between medieval myth and modern conspiracy, uniting strands we've traced since the Magdalene's supposed landing relics, arriving from the Levant dynasties, claiming sacred descent, Vatican efforts at controlling narratives. Each thread seems to converge here in a chapel where the walls still smell faintly of incense and old plaster. Standing at the threshold of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene today, you might feel that peculiar hush that settles over places where faith, rumor, and unresolved history meet. Whether it guards a fortune in Visigothic gold or a parchment that could upend theological authority, Rennes-le-Château remains a locus of the great unanswered question: did the priest merely restore his parish, or did he uncover a trace of the lost bloodline of the Messiah? That question prepares us for the next layer of intrigue. A 20th-century discovery of supposed secret dossiers deposited in the French National Library, claiming that a clandestine brotherhood, the Priory of Souillon, had protected Christ's heirs for centuries. Step into the hushed reading room of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in the 1960s, dust drifting through slanted shafts of light oak tables, polished by generations of elbows, and amid the catalog drawers, a small set of typewritten pages that would ignite decades of speculation. These were the so-called dossiers secrets d'Henri Lobineau files that purported to reveal a clandestine brotherhood known as the Priory of Sion, sworn for centuries to safeguard the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The one verifiable historical fact in this tangle is that in 1967 and again in the early 1970s, a man named Pierre Plantard, along with a collaborator, Philippe de Chérizet, deposited several genealogical charts, letters, and narratives under the collective title Dossier Secrets into the public records section of the French National Library. These deposits are documented. Any researcher may still request the microfilm. The papers trace the French Merovingian line and allege its survival into modern families, implying a bloodline that began not in the forests of the Franks, but in first-century Judea. An obscure yet revealing detail is that the earliest pages list Grand Masters of the Priory, with names both historical and improbable, Leonardo da Vinci among them, suggesting that the compilers hoped to wrap their tale in the prestige of genius. Some sheets contained coded maps that, once deciphered, appeared to point back to the region of Rennes-le-Château, thereby knitting the modern files to Saunière's century-old mystery, and by extension, to Magdalene legends in Languedoc. The open question, of course, is authenticity. Investigative journalists in the 1990s uncovered testimony from de Chérissé, admitting that many of the documents were modern creations designed as an elaborate hoax to promote Plantard's personal claims to noble heritage. French courts later interrogated Plantard during a political scandal. Under oath, he renounced any assertion of messianic descent. Mainstream historians today regard the dossier secrets as 20th-century fabrications laced with selective historical facts. Yet the dossier's impact cannot be dismissed. Their blend of verifiable genealogical references, medieval place names, and invented intrigue convinced many readers that they were seeing only the tip of an older archive. Best-selling books in the 1980s and 1990s, most famously Holy Blood, Holy Grail, built entire narratives upon these pages, rekindling public fascination with the notion of a protected sacred lineage and its collision with Vatican power. Think back to the mist-laden hill of Rennes-le-Château, the peculiar icons in Saunière's church, and the Magdalene voyage across the Mediterranean. The dossier's secrets acted like a bridge across centuries, claiming to tie those scattered legends into a single unbroken chain, leading straight to the Merovingian dynasty and beyond. For believers in a real bloodline, the papers offered confirmation. For skeptics, they were evidence only of how easily the hunger for mystery can be exploited. A touch of wry amusement is hard to resist here, the supposed guardians of an ancient dynasty, secretly depositing their greatest revelations at a public library, as if history's most explosive secret were just waiting patiently on a shelf next to shipping manifests and parish tax rolls. The image is almost comically bureaucratic, yet it reflects the strange alchemy by which myth often mingles with mundane procedure. The dossier's notoriety has since drawn academic scrutiny to genuine medieval charters cited within them, some authentic, others doctored. Even stripped of the hoaxer's embellishments, those real charters reveal that the Merovingians intermarried with noble houses of Septimania, a region historically rich with Jewish and Visigothic communities. While that fact alone proves nothing about a messianic heir, it shows how Plantard and de Chérissé built their fiction upon kernels of legitimate archival data, making it harder to dismiss every thread outright. The debate remains unresolved. Were the Priory of Sion papers merely a 20th-century publicity stunt, grafted onto medieval rumor, or a deliberate smokescreen obscuring fragments of a genuine hidden tradition? The answer seems destined to stay suspended between skepticism and longing, feeding novels, documentaries, and tourist economies in equal measure. Regardless of their authenticity, the dossier's revived attention to visual clues left behind in Europe's sacred spaces hints that some messages might not have been committed to parchment at all, but encoded in glass, stone, and pigment. To follow that thread, we step now from archives and courtrooms into the filtered light of medieval cathedrals, where sunlight through colored panes may hold its own cryptic commentary on who bore the blood of the Messiah. The hush of archives gives way to the colored hush of stained glass, where light filters through saints and symbols painted in jewel-bright hues. Medieval Europe's cathedrals were not merely places of worship. They were stone libraries for the illiterate, teaching through image and pattern what parchment and Latin could not convey. If sensitive stories were too dangerous to write down, artists sometimes tucked them into the margins of murals, the folds of robes, or the geometry of rose windows. For seekers of the lost bloodline, these visual whispers have long been regarded as a clandestine gallery of clues. One historical fact grounds this search from the 12th century onward. Gothic cathedrals, like Chartres Reims and Notre Dame in Paris, commissioned vast cycles of biblical scenes guided by clerical advisors. Artisans often followed official iconographic programs, yet they also borrowed from local folklore and apocryphal tales. This blend of sanctioned scripture and regional legend created a visual tapestry where subtle anomalies sometimes escaped doctrinal censors. A particularly obscure example can be seen in a series of 12th century stained glass panels at Chartres Cathedral depicting the genealogy of Christ. Unlike many later representations that emphasize the Virgin's purity, these early windows devote generous space to the branching family tree of Jesse, complete with names of Old Testament patriarchs, a reminder to worshippers that lineage mattered as much as miracle. Some researchers point to the unusually prominent female figures in these panels, suggesting that the artisans were drawing attention to maternal descent in a way that diverged from the prevailing male line emphasis. Mainstream historians see this as ordinary biblical storytelling, yet to those tracing a Magdalene connection, the prominence of certain matriarchs appears deliberate. Another frequently cited detail hides in a 13th century fresco fragment from a former Templar chapel near Cressac, France. The scene portrays the wedding at Cana, yet curiously the bride is painted with a halo identical to the groom's, both flanked by disciples whose gestures suggest homage. Some iconographers interpret the equal halos as a symbolic pairing of Christ and the Church, a standard theological motif. Others, more conspiratorially inclined, claim the painter was nodding to an earthly union, perhaps even hinting at Jesus' own marriage. There is no consensus, but the anomaly fuels speculation that the artist preserved a local tradition, contradicting official teaching. The open question that confronts scholars of medieval art is whether these anomalies were intentional signals or the natural byproducts of artistic license and evolving devotion. Cathedral workshops employed craftsmen from various regions, each bringing folk motifs and personal flourishes. What appears to be a secret sign could just as easily be a stylistic quirk or an imported decorative pattern misunderstood by later viewers. Connecting back to the Priory of Sion dossiers and the Rennes-le-Château mystery enthusiasts often highlight the Magdalene imagery that proliferated in southern French churches from the 12th century onward. In certain altarpieces, she is shown holding a chalice etched with a rose-shaped emblem, a symbol later conflated with the Grail and royal blood. Scholars counter that the rose chalice was a common attribute of penitent Magdalene representing her ointment jar or devotion. The tension between orthodox interpretation and heterodox reading turns these works of art into contested texts, open to whichever narrative the beholder favors. A wry smile seems almost inevitable as you picture a medieval glazier or mason focused mainly on meeting deadlines and appeasing patrons, unwittingly leaving behind shapes and gestures that centuries later would be scrutinized like coded telegrams to future treasure hunters. One suspects the artisans might be baffled to learn that a misplaced curl of a vine pattern is now interpreted as evidence of a messianic dynasty. Nevertheless, the persistence of these visual cues reveals a cultural undercurrent. In an age when few could read the positioning of Magdalene near the foot of the cross, the prominence of her vessel in paintings, and the occasional portrayal of her as richly robed rather than penitent, reinforced her significance beyond that of a mere repentant sinner. Whether intended or not, such imagery kept alive the idea that her role in the gospel drama was equal in dignity to that of the apostles, and therefore a plausible matriarch in the imagination of later storytellers. This visual thread leads naturally back toward the source of many relic legends, the Temple Mount itself, where ancient genealogical records were once stored. If artistic hints across Europe kept the legend of a holy lineage alive, some believe the most decisive proof, if it still exists, may lie buried in sealed chambers beneath the stones of Jerusalem, waiting to be uncovered. The air grows cooler as the narrative turns back toward Jerusalem, where the foundations of the ancient temple lie hidden beneath centuries of conquest and construction. Beneath the paving stones, walked by pilgrims and tourists, today stretches a labyrinth of cisterns, vaulted halls, and sealed passageways, a palimpsest of sacred geography. For those searching for evidence of a messianic lineage, the most persistent legend is that somewhere under these stones lies a sealed tomb or chamber containing genealogical records of David's house, perhaps even relics tied to the earliest followers of Jesus. A secure historical fact frames this legend: the Temple of Jerusalem was not merely a place of worship, but also the repository of Israel's genealogical archives. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records that priestly and royal lineages were meticulously maintained and stored there to verify claims of descent. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, those records were presumed lost in the fires. The obliteration of such archives effectively erased official proof of Davidic heritage for any future claimant to messiahship. An obscure yet fascinating clue comes from medieval Islamic chronicles describing sealed subterranean chambers discovered during early Muslim renovations of the Haram al-Sharaf, the area now encompassing the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Some chroniclers mentioned inscriptions in older scripts and stone chests that were quickly reburied or sealed. The details are sparse, often second-hand, but they fuel speculation that remnants of pre-Roman archives or burials may have survived the conflagration of 70 CE. The open question remains whether any such chamber could still exist untouched beneath the mount, despite centuries of construction, earthquakes, and political upheaval. Archaeologists agree that large portions of the underground area have yet to be explored with modern methods due to religious and political sensitivities. Excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by explorers such as Charles Warren mapped several cisterns and tunnels, but were halted long before reaching sealed areas directly beneath the sacred platform. Connecting back to the lore of the Knights Templar, remember that for nearly a decade, the earliest Templars occupied quarters on this very mount. Later legend insists they dug secret tunnels in search of temple treasure or scripture. Although no physical evidence links them to a specific discovery, the overlap between the historical fact of the temple's genealogical archives and the persistent rumor of Templar excavation keeps alive the possibility, however faint, that something once retrieved there was carried west. One lesser-known but verifiable episode occurred in 1967 during the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when Israeli authorities undertook limited archaeological surveys near the Western Wall tunnels. Unconfirmed reports from workers at the time spoke of sealed masonry corridors leading beneath the mount, promptly closed off due to religious objections. While no official publication has documented these findings, the reports contribute to the aura of a hidden subterranean vault, still awaiting systematic exploration. You might allow yourself a dry smile, imagining the most sensitive religious site on earth, hiding not a cache of gold or weapons, but merely filing cabinets of first-century birth certificates, documents that, if ever uncovered, could redraw the family tree of biblical history. The juxtaposition of bureaucratic parchment and apocalyptic expectation has an almost absurd edge, yet it highlights how powerfully records can shape faith. For scholars, the true significance of any surviving genealogical scroll would be its potential to confirm the existence of Davidic claimants in the early 1st century. Such evidence would not by itself prove a connection to Jesus, but it could lend weight to traditions that his family's claim was once officially registered. For believers in a hidden bloodline, that would be one step closer to vindication. The possibility of an unexcavated chamber beneath the Temple Mount ties our story back to every previous thread: the prophecies of a royal heir, the lost gospel of the Nazarenes, the Templar custodianship, and the relics brought to Europe. If proof of lineage survived anywhere, this sacred ground, and perhaps the vaults beneath it, would be the logical place to begin the search. The thought of ancient chests sealed by temple priests 2 millennia ago, still resting behind unmarked stones, lingers like the echo of a psalm. Until politics, religion, and science find a way to cooperate, that echo will remain unanswered, leaving the legend of a forbidden tomb beneath Jerusalem as one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in the quest for the Messiah's lost bloodline. The candlelight in our imagined archive now pools across portraits of solemn-faced nobles whose eyes follow you from gilt frames. These families, draped in centuries of privilege, were often less concerned with the cross on the altar than with the blood in their veins. Across Europe, certain aristocratic houses claimed an ancestry more ancient than their medieval titles suggested. Among them grew a legend that some branches, discreetly without public proclamation, had interwoven themselves with a lineage tracing back to the Holy Land, and perhaps, according to whispers, to the bloodline of the Messiah. A firm historical fact grounds this exploration in medieval and early modern Europe. Strategic marriage alliances between royal and noble houses were meticulously documented, often preserved in heraldic rolls that survive today. These unions sometimes reached beyond regional borders. Frankish, Visigothic, Lombard, and later Venetian and Genoese families intermarried to consolidate influence. Such patterns created webs of kinship that spanned Christendom's courts. The term black nobility emerged much later, a 19th-century label for a group of powerful Roman aristocratic families, the Orsini Colonna Borghese, and others who aligned themselves with the papacy during shifting political eras. Their historical existence is not in dispute. What is contested is the rumor that their lineage carried an ancient Semitic thread, possibly absorbed through Crusader or Levantine marriages centuries before. Though genealogists can confirm Mediterranean intermarriage, no verifiable record ties these lines directly to biblical descent. An obscure yet provocative detail sometimes cited by esoteric historians is a 14th-century marriage contract linking a cadet branch of the Merovingian-descended de Boulogne family to a Venetian patrician house involved in financing Crusader ventures. The contract itself survives in a regional archive in northern Italy. While it proves only a political union, speculative writers see in it a channel through which any surviving Magdalene Davidic blood could have mingled into later continental elites. Here arises the open question: did these noble houses cultivate legends of sacred ancestry as a political tool to sanctify their power? Or did kernels of a real but unrecorded heritage survive beneath the heraldic claims? Historians lean toward the former, noting that medieval Europe often embraced mythical Trojan or Arthurian forebears to ennoble dynasties. Yet the persistence of rumors, specifically invoking Judean or Davidic descent, hints at a fascination that may have been sparked by older regional memories, particularly in southern France and northern Spain, where the Magdalene cult had taken root. Think back to the Sang Real of the Merovingians, the Magdalene shrines of Provence, and the relics that filtered into noble treasuries after the Crusades. The legends surrounding the black nobility function like an echo of those earlier strands, suggesting that whispers of a sacred bloodline never fully vanished, but migrated upward into aristocratic family lore. Modern DNA research into European nobility occasionally reports traces of Levantine genetic markers. Unsurprising, given centuries of Crusader interaction and Mediterranean trade. But such findings cannot pinpoint descent from any specific historical figure. Nonetheless, these hints feed a cultural narrative that certain lineages carried something older and more exotic than Frankish or Germanic stock. You may allow yourself a wry smile at the image of solemn genealogists bent over dusty charts, while distant cousins spin dinner-party tales of being heirs to the House of David. If any of those claims were ever substantiated, they would have disrupted not just polite conversation, but the very hierarchy of both church and throne. The intersection of dynastic ambition, church patronage, and persistent regional legend kept alive the possibility, however tenuous, that Europe's upper crust might conceal a living link to the first-century Holy Land. This motif leads us naturally to a more modern tool unavailable to medieval chroniclers, the genetic sciences that now examine bloodlines, not by scroll, but by chromosome-seeking material evidence of the traces so long wrapped in myth. The candlelit archive now hums faintly with the imagined sound of laboratory machines, centrifuges spinning, sequencers clicking, as the investigation steps into the modern age. Where parchments fray and legends blur, genetics offers a new kind of witness, one etched into the double helix, carried quietly across migrations and centuries. If a bloodline truly descended from a first-century Judean family survived into Europe, then traces of its ancestry might still be detectable in the DNA of populations historically linked to those regions. A solid historical fact anchors this quest. Geneticists have successfully traced the priestly Jewish caste, known as the Kohanim, by identifying a characteristic set of Y chromosome markers, the Cohen modal haplotype shared among many Jewish men who claim patrilineal descent from Aaron, Moses' brother. This achievement demonstrates that, in principle, ancient genealogical continuity can survive 2 millennia of diaspora. An obscure and intriguing data point emerged from early 2000s research by teams studying Jewish diaspora communities in North Africa and the Levant. They found that Galilean Jewish populations from certain mountain villages displayed distinctive clusters of mitochondrial DNA, also found among some southern French families with documented Sephardic roots. These findings are far from evidence of a messianic lineage. They merely show that migration between the Holy Land and Mediterranean Gaul left genetic echoes. Still, such echoes lend scientific plausibility to the historical record of Jewish settlement along the Rhône and Garonne rivers dating back to Roman times, precisely the corridors where Magdalene legends later thrived. The open question that excites both enthusiasts and skeptics is whether any extant European bloodlines reputedly tied to the Merovingians, or so-called black nobility, carry haplogroups more typical of first-century Judeans than of Frankish or Germanic stock. Limited studies of noble families are complicated by small sample sizes, privacy concerns, and centuries of intermarriage that have blurred distinctive markers. To date, no published peer-reviewed study has identified a unique Davidic genetic signature in these lineages. Think back to the previous chapter's musings on heraldic claims. Coats of arms can be forged, parchments lost or faked, but chromosomes have no motive. Yet genetics cannot resurrect specific names from antiquity. At best, it can reveal patterns of shared ancestry between populations. That limitation has become a focal point of scholarly debate. Some historians caution that even if a cluster of Merovingian descendants carried Levantine markers, it could be explained by countless medieval marriages, with crusaders, merchants, or exiles, proof only of contact, not of sacred descent. A touch of gentle humor surfaces when imagining the solemn faces of medieval kings' men who fought wars over scrolls proving noble birth, now reduced to swabs of saliva mailed to a lab waiting for results to see whether their vaunted bloodline was just ordinary Mediterranean mix all along. The irony is both humbling and oddly satisfying. Nonetheless, the pursuit of genetic footprints has practical historical value. Studies on ancient Judean remains from first-century burial sites around Jerusalem, teeth and bone fragments carefully analyzed under strict protocols reveal lineages still present among modern Levantine and certain European Jewish communities. If ever a relic confidently tied to a descendant of Jesus or Magdalene were found, such as a verified ossuary containing recoverable DNA, scientists could theoretically compare its markers to these living populations. But no such authenticated relic has yet appeared. Connecting this scientific detour back to our narrative's candlelit path, the genetic quest does not replace legend or theology. It highlights how the search for the Messiah's supposed heirs has evolved from parchment and stained glass to pipettes and genome maps. Each tool tells part of the story, yet all remain inconclusive without that missing linchpin, a verified, datable link between biblical figures and modern families. The promise and limits of genetics keep the mystery suspended between evidence and yearning. It is a reminder that while DNA can illuminate migrations, it cannot alone prove that a Galilean carpenter's lineage survived into the palaces of Europe. That lingering uncertainty guides us back to the human side of this saga. The scholars who ventured into the Vatican's guarded stacks, sometimes at great professional risk, seeking the very documents that might bridge the gap between scripture rumor and biology. The echo of laboratory machines fades, replaced once again by the quiet shuffling of leather-soled shoes across marble floors. Picture the Vatican Library as it appeared in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, vaulted ceilings painted with saints and cherubs, endless ranks of chained folios, the air heavy with the scent of dust and ink. Founded in the mid-15th century by Pope Nicholas II, this library became one of the world's richest repositories of religious and historical manuscripts. Officially, it has always been open in principle to qualified scholars. Yet many of its most intriguing holdings are stored in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the secret archives, whose contents require papal or prefectural permission to view. A secure historical fact grounds this chapter. Over the centuries, numerous reputable researchers have requested access to certain sealed collections and been denied, often without explanation. The reasons given were usually mundane conservation concerns, diplomatic sensitivity, incomplete cataloging, yet the lack of transparency inevitably fed the suspicion that something more consequential lay hidden. One particularly obscure but telling incident involved the German historian Joseph Hergenrother, appointed as the first cardinal archivist of the Vatican in 1881 when Pope Leo III formally opened the archives for scholarly research. Hergenrother reported that entire bundles of medieval inquisitorial proceedings and early church correspondence were temporarily withdrawn from consultation at the discretion of curators. He never specified what these bundles contained, but later biographers noted his frustration at being unable to examine certain early Christian dossiers that he believed could illuminate doctrinal disputes. An open question that continues to animate debate is whether some of those withdrawn files included genealogical material concerning the Despacini, the blood relatives of Jesus, recorded by the 2nd century historian Hegesippus, or even traces of apocryphal gospels, such as the Lost Gospel of the Nazarenes. There is no catalog entry that confirms such documents exist. Still, the idea that church officials quietly sidelined manuscripts touching on Christ's family tree is persistent enough to appear in memoirs and correspondence of several 19th century theologians. This chapter ties back to earlier threads in our investigation, the Vatican's historical pattern of shaping the biblical canon, the suppression of Gnostic texts, and the Gelasian decree condemning Apocrypha. Scholars sympathetic to the theory of a suppressed bloodline argue that these precedents show a long institutional habit of excising materials that complicated the official portrait of a purely divine celibate Messiah. A particularly dramatic 20th century episode is that of Jesuit historian Father Malachi Martin, who before leaving the priesthood claimed to have handled confidential papal files hinting at dynastic controversies surrounding the early church. Mainstream academics caution that Martin's later writings blurred memoir with speculative fiction, making it impossible to separate verifiable archival experience from literary flourish. Yet his allegations revived public curiosity about what might still be under lock and key in Rome. There is a quiet irony, almost humorous, in imagining generations of earnest scholars hunched over medieval Latin ledgers, hoping to glimpse a shred of parchment, proving a royal descendant of Christ, only to be told politely that the requested folio is under restoration for decades at a time. Such scenes feel lifted from a novel, yet they have been attested in letters of complaint lodged by researchers denied access to unspecified codices. The Vatican Library today maintains that its closed holdings are largely routine private correspondence of modern popes, diplomatic negotiations, or fragile papyri requiring conservation. But because true transparency has never been achieved, each pontificate retaining discretion over declassification, the suspicion of deliberate concealment persists. As long as that suspicion lingers, the idea of suppressed genealogical proof retains a shadow of plausibility in the public imagination. This tension between scholarly pursuit and ecclesiastical gatekeeping brings us back once more to the roots of the matter, how the earliest compilers of Christian scripture decided what to keep and what to discard. For that pivotal editorial moment, we turn to the 4th century councils that canonized the official Gospels, whose decisions may have trimmed away any hints of an earthly dynasty springing from the Messiah. The story now drifts back to the year 325 CE to a lakeside city in Bithynia, where bishops from across the empire gathered at the command of Emperor Constantine. Nicaea's great basilica shimmered with imperial banners and the scent of oil lamps as clerics debated the nature of Christ, divine, human, or both, in ways no creed had yet resolved. While the council's official purpose was to quell theological schism about Christ's divinity, its decisions set the precedent for shaping a unified narrative of the faith. For those who suspect that a bloodline story was trimmed from history, Nicaea represents the symbolic moment when editorial blades were first drawn. A verifiable historical fact, the First Council of Nicaea primarily addressed the Arian controversy, producing the Nicene Creed, to assert the Son's co-eternity with the Father. It did not fix the biblical canon in its final form. That process continued in later councils, such as those at Hippo 393 and Carthage 397. Yet Nicaea's imperial endorsement gave the emerging Orthodox party power to suppress rival texts. Bishops who dissented found their writings confiscated or condemned. The political alliance of throne and altar begun here reshaped which stories would be copied by state-supported scribes and which would be left to decay. An obscure yet revealing historical note involves Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's trusted church historian and participant at Nicaea. In his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius selectively quoted earlier sources to support the idea of apostolic succession through bishops rather than through any hereditary kin of Jesus. His omissions have drawn scholarly critique for centuries, with some modern researchers suggesting that he deliberately downplayed the role of the Desposini, the Lord's blood relatives, to reinforce episcopal authority. There is no proof that he excised explicit references to a marriage or child of Jesus, but his bias toward a non-dynastic church is evident in the pattern of his citations. The open question that endures is how many alternative gospel traditions were effectively silenced in the generations following Nicaea's precedent. We know from surviving fragments such as the Gospel of the Nazarenes and the Gnostic texts at Nag Hammadi that the early Christian landscape was diverse. Had any of those rival accounts emphasized an earthly lineage for the Messiah, they would likely have been among the first victims of this drive toward doctrinal uniformity. Think back to our exploration of the Vatican's edicts of erasure and the suppressed scholars in the library. Those later acts of censorship can be seen as descendants of the mindset crystallized at Nicaea faith, defined not only by revelation, but by editorial decision. Once a creed placed Christ firmly in the realm of the eternal and unbegotten, any text implying an ongoing human bloodline became theologically inconvenient, even subversive. A gentle touch of irony arises when imagining exhausted 4th-century bishops, after days of debating Greek philosophical terms like homoousios and homoousios, reaching for the quills that would forever shape Scripture, unaware that centuries later, entire thriller novels would accuse them of conspiring to hide a royal baby. They were likely preoccupied with empire-wide schism, not clandestine heirs, yet their work had that unintended consequence. The Council's drive for unity coincided with Constantine's political agenda. A divided church was a threat to imperial stability. By favoring texts that elevated the spiritual kingship of Christ over any dynastic claim through his kin, the emerging canon served both theology and politics. Over time, other gospels fell out of circulation, copying stopped parchments crumbled. Whether by deliberate excision or by benign neglect, memories of Jesus' extended family were largely pushed to the margins of church history. This editorial winnowing prepares us to examine one region that resisted some of these orthodox currents, the Languedoc of southern France, where devotion to Mary Magdalene blossomed into a unique cultic tradition. Here, centuries after Nicaea, folk memory and heretical movements rekindled the notion that Magdalene's role was more than that of a penitent witness, perhaps even that of a matriarch. The trail now winds back to the rugged hills and lavender valleys of southern France, where the scent of thyme drifts over Romanesque chapels and limestone caves. Long after the councils of the 4th century had defined Orthodox belief, the people of the Languedoc nurtured a devotion to Mary Magdalene that stood apart from the penitential image preached elsewhere in Europe. Here she was, not only the weeping sinner at the foot of the cross, but the apostle to the apostles, the first witness of the resurrection, and in whispers carried from village to village, perhaps even the mother of a sacred legacy. A verifiable historical fact anchors this chapter by the 11th century shrines dedicated to Magdalene dotted the Provençal landscape. The cave at Saint-Baume became a renowned pilgrimage site where medieval pilgrims believed she had spent her last years in prayer and solitude. Monastic charters and local parish records confirm a continuous cultic veneration, with relic processions drawing devotees from across the region. An obscure and fascinating detail appears in 12th century liturgical dramas performed in the Languedoc, where Magdalene was sometimes portrayed not as the fallen woman of Gregory the Great's homilies, but as a noble lady richly robed arriving by boat from the east, with a retinue. This portrayal echoed the Provençal legend of her landing on the Camargue coast. The same tradition we traced earlier and reinforced the idea of her as a bearer of dignity and mission rather than penitence alone. The open question for historians is why the Magdalene cult flourished so intensely here compared to other regions of Christendom. Some attribute it to the strong influence of Eastern monasticism carried by pilgrims and crusaders returning from the Levant. Others see in it the survival of older local stories linking the hills of Provence to the earliest Christian diaspora stories that may have included hints of a family carried westward under her protection. This thread connects back to the visual anomalies discussed in the chapter on medieval art. In several southern French churches, Magdalene appears enthroned beside the Virgin, or standing closest to Christ in passion scenes, a prominence rarely granted elsewhere. Art historians often explain this as local devotional preference, yet for those seeking traces of a holy bloodline, the imagery appears as a subtle acknowledgement of her elevated status. A touch of wry humor lingers in the thought of traveling merchants and troubadours carrying not just news and songs, but embroidered tales about Magdalene's hidden child, spinning sacred gossip between markets and feasts. Folklore can be as persistent as any royal decree, and in the Languedoc, it thrived under the patronage of local nobles who sometimes traced their heritage to early Christian settlers. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the region became fertile ground for heterodox movements such as the Cathars, whose dualist theology challenged Rome's authority. Though the Cathars themselves left no written claims about a Magdalene bloodline, the Church's crusade against them, the brutal Albigensian Crusade, helped to erase countless local traditions. Some modern researchers speculate that in destroying Cathar strongholds, inquisitors may also have obliterated regional archives and oral histories tied to the Magdalene cult's more unorthodox legends. The persistence of her veneration in Provence, despite papal campaigns to standardize her image, illustrates the tension between centralized theology and local memory. While official sermons emphasized her penitence, village processions crowned her as patroness, healer, even protector of sailors. That divergence kept alive a view of Magdalene as more than the forgiven sinner sustaining a cultural climate in which the idea of her as matriarch of a hidden lineage could take root and endure in popular imagination. This Provençal devotion, passed down in chance carvings and seasonal festivals, forms a living link to the earliest rumors of a family line crossing the sea. It also sets the stage for one of the most enduring symbols in our entire investigation, the Holy Grail itself, whose meaning, whether vessel or bloodline, has oscillated through centuries of legend. The narrative now enters the Twilight realm, where relic and myth intertwine the legend of the Holy Grail. No single symbol has so persistently captured the Western imagination, from medieval romances to modern novels, as that elusive vessel said to have caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion. Yet beneath the poetry of knights on quests lies an older linguistic puzzle that has fueled one of the boldest reinterpretations of sacred history. A verifiable historical fact grounds our exploration. The earliest surviving reference to the Grail appears in the late 12th century verse of Chrétien de Troyes, whose unfinished romance, Perceval ou le Comte du Graal, described a mysterious serving dish carried in a procession. Chrétien never called it holy, nor fixed its form as a chalice. Later poets like Robert de Boron added the detail that it was the cup of the Last Supper, which Joseph of Arimathea used to catch Christ's blood. These successive embellishments show that the Grail legend evolved over time, shaped by devotional imagination rather than anchored in a single ancient relic. An obscure and telling detail emerges from the etymology itself. In Old French, Saint Grail, Holy Grail, can also be parsed as sang réel, meaning royal blood. This linguistic ambiguity, probably accidental in medieval poetry, inspired 20th century writers to propose that the Grail quest was originally a coded search, not for a chalice but for a bloodline. Though philologists caution that medieval audiences likely understood Saint Grail only as holy vessel, the Pune's existence provided fertile ground for speculative reinterpretation. The open question is whether the imagery of a vessel, a cup, a dish, a womb-shaped container emerged symbolically to represent the idea of lineage long before novelists popularized the theory. Anthropologists note that in many ancient cultures, vessels often symbolized life and continuity. It is conceivable, though unproven, that medieval storytellers unconsciously fused biblical and folkloric motifs to link Christ's blood sacramental wine and the mystery of inheritance. Think back to the Magdalene cult of the Languedoc, where in regional artwork she is frequently depicted holding a vessel sometimes ornate like a chalice, sometimes simple as a jar of ointment. Orthodox iconography interprets this as her anointing role, yet in the context of Sangreal speculation, the vessel becomes emblematic of her as bearer of a royal lineage. This dual-reading devotional versus dynastic shows how a single image can serve two narratives at once, depending on the viewer's assumptions. A touch of gentle humor arises when you picture earnest medieval knights enduring frostbite and dragons, or at least brigands on legendary quests for a cup, unaware that centuries later, scholars would argue the real treasure might have been a family tree hidden in parish registries. It is a reminder that human imagination often turns mundane realities into mythic adventures and vice versa. Despite centuries of searches in abbeys, caves, and castles, no artifact has ever been authenticated as the Holy Grail. Modern historians largely regard it as a literary creation of the High Middle Ages, perhaps inspired by older Celtic cauldron myths of inexhaustible sustenance. Yet the Grail story's persistence shows how strongly European culture yearned for a tangible link to the divine, whether a cup touched by Christ or a bloodline carrying his legacy. This yearning connects naturally back to the relic trade described earlier. Both relics and the Grail myth reflect a medieval desire to bridge heaven and earth through something materially graspable, a bone, a splinter, a chalice, or even the veins of a child said to inherit sacred blood. Each object served as a promise that the holy had not entirely departed the mortal world. The shift from vessel to bloodline in Grail interpretation gained modern prominence through books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail in the 1980s, which argued controversially and without scholarly consensus that the Grail legend preserved memories of Magdalene's descendants in France. While academics dispute its historical foundation, the thesis popularized the idea that an entire corpus of medieval Romance literature might have been a veiled chronicle of dynastic survival. Whether cup or lineage, the Grail remains a symbol of continuity of blood carried forward. And in that sense, it serves as the thematic hinge of our entire investigation, the search for proof that the story of Christ did not end at Golgotha, but took root in flesh and ancestry. This dual interpretation of the Grail brings us next to the more bureaucratic and less romantic side of secrecy, the papal bulls and sealed decrees that across the centuries restricted research into certain dynastic archives and kept potentially disruptive genealogical claims under lock and key. The journey now returns to the echo of official corridors in Rome, marble floors, cool beneath clerical sandals, wax seals pressed against parchment ribbons, the scent of lamp oil and damp stone. Beyond the dramatic legends of Grail knights and Magdalene shrines, there lies the quieter machinery of authority, papal bulls, and sealed decrees that for centuries regulated who could read, which archives could be opened, and which lines of inquiry were to be left undisturbed. A firm historical fact frames this part of the story. Papal bulls, formal edicts bearing the lead seal or bulla of the reigning pope, were the primary legal instruments of the medieval papacy. They could establish monasteries, excommunicate rulers, or command the custody of particular relics and documents. Surviving registers from the 13th through 17th centuries confirm that successive pontiffs issued bulls restricting access to diocesan archives, especially in matters involving heresy trials, dynastic disputes, and property claims. An obscure but telling example is the bull ad extirpanda issued in 1252 by Pope Innocent IV, primarily authorizing measures against heresy in northern Italy. While its main text dealt with inquisitorial procedure, an appended directive preserved in a Venetian copy ordered that records concerning the genealogy of certain sectarians be withheld from local notaries and transferred under seal to papal custody. Historians generally interpret this as an attempt to centralize sensitive evidence for trials, yet the phrase has intrigued later researchers who wonder what genealogical matters so alarmed the pontiff. Another intriguing instance surfaces in 16th century Spain under the reign of Philip II, when papal briefs instructed that archives of converso families' Jewish converts to Christianity be carefully monitored, because questions of blood purity affected both church benefices and royal marriages. These measures reveal that lineage even outside the realm of biblical speculation was a subject of acute ecclesiastical control. The open question that continues to spark debate is whether some of these sealed directives ever encompassed manuscripts hinting at a messianic bloodline. No known bull explicitly mentions the descendants of Christ, yet historians sympathetic to the theory argue that papal efforts to monopolize dynastic data created an environment where any such rumor could be suppressed without leaving an obvious paper trail. Think back to the Council of Nicaea's editorial precedent and the Vatican Library's restricted stacks. The continuity is striking from the 4th century creed to late medieval bulls' institutional guardianship of doctrine often included management of genealogical narratives. This pattern makes it plausible, though not provable, that any text challenging the theology of a celibate, purely divine Messiah would have been swept into the same vaults as politically sensitive dynastic records. A faint smile may come unbidden when you picture solemn papal secretaries laboring over wax seals at midnight, convinced they were protecting the faith, unaware that centuries later, novelists would cast them as keepers of a royal family tree. The contrast between their bureaucratic routine and the conspiratorial mystique it later inspired feels almost theatrical. Some bulls dealt less with secrecy than with silence. In the 17th century, Pope Urban VII's decree against publishing certain biblical commentaries without Roman approval reflected a desire to maintain interpretive unity, effectively discouraging speculative genealogies that strayed beyond sanctioned exegesis. By restricting who could publish interpretations of Scripture's more obscure passages, including the disputed genealogies of Matthew and Luke, the papacy indirectly limited discussion of any earthly descendants. This paper-bound history of sealed decrees reinforces a recurring theme that control over lineage stories was often exercised through legal instruments rather than overt proclamations. The chain of wax seals and parchment ribbons forms a quiet counterpoint to the romanticized quests for chalices and hidden tombs. Yet in its way, it proved just as effective at shaping which stories endured. With the bureaucratic arm of secrecy thus explored, the investigation now turns toward the realm of myth once more, to the medieval romances of Britain and Gaul, where the figure of the Fisher King and the Grail Knights preserved echoes of a wounded bloodline waiting to be healed. The story drifts northward now across the Channel, into the mists of Celtic legend, where medieval romance poets wove the Grail into the saga of a wounded monarch known as the Fisher King. This king, often depicted as the last guardian of the Grail, suffers an unhealing wound in his thigh or groin, a detail whose symbolism has puzzled storytellers for centuries. His affliction renders his land barren until a destined knight arrives to ask the healing question. Beneath the chivalric veneer, some historians and folklorists have detected faint echoes of dynastic loss and hidden inheritance. A solid historical fact anchors this chapter. The Fisher King motif appears most clearly in 12th and 13th century Grail romances by Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. These tales drew upon a fusion of Christian Celtic and possibly Near Eastern motifs transmitted through Crusader contact. In Wolfram's Parzival, the Grail is no longer merely a chalice, but a mysterious stone safeguarded by a hereditary line of Grail keepers, suggesting a tradition of sacred stewardship passed down through generations. An obscure but intriguing element surfaces in certain Welsh triads and Irish sagas that predate the written Grail romances, kings, whose injuries to the thigh or loins symbolize the wounding of their fertility, and thus the sterility of their realm. Some scholars interpret this as a mythic reflection of dynastic interruption, the loss of an heir bringing decline to the kingdom. When absorbed into Christianized Grail tales, the motif gained new resonance, a once royal bloodline laid low, awaiting restoration. The open question for literary historians is whether these chivalric stories were purely allegorical morality plays, or if they carried veiled references to real historical memories, perhaps the downfall of an ancient lineage tied in rumor, if not in fact, to the Holy Land. Advocates of the Sangreal theory argue that the barren king awaiting healing was a poetic stand-in for a wounded bloodline that could be revived only when its hidden story was revealed. Mainstream medievalists caution that the motif likely served symbolic and theological functions, portraying the soul's fall and redemption rather than dynastic politics. Think back to the dual meaning of the Grail vessel or bloodline and the Magdalene cult that flourished in Languedoc. In that context, the Fisher King's wasting wound acquires an added layer of family line rendered sterile by suppression, its vitality restored only when the true heir is acknowledged. Such interpretation remains speculative, yet it demonstrates how seamlessly myth and memory can blur when transmitted orally across cultures and centuries. A touch of wry humor might be indulged here. One imagines a medieval minstrel spinning this solemn tale in a drafty hall, more concerned with keeping his audience awake on a winter's night than with preserving coded genealogical testimony for future historians. If he inadvertently carried forward an echo of a wounded royal house, it was likely accidental. Still, the persistence of this legend, a hidden line, a guardianship of a sacred object, a restoration promised, resonates uncannily with earlier themes in our investigation. The sang real of the Merovingians, the relic-laden crusader chests the papal bulls that sealed away inconvenient genealogies. The Fisher King's wound, however mythic, mirrors the sense of an interrupted inheritance running through these stories. This romantic but haunting strand prepares us for the penultimate phase of the investigation, when the narrative returns to the present day to examine modern individuals and families who claim with varying degrees of documentation and credibility to descend from that long-supposed sacred branch of history. The echoes of minstrels fade into the quieter hum of 21st-century living rooms, DNA kits on coffee tables and family crests framed above mantels. Across Europe and occasionally beyond a handful of families, some aristocratic, others modest in background, have stepped forward over the past century to suggest, sometimes in earnest and sometimes with a flair for publicity, that their lineage traces to the blood of the Messiah. Their stories range from carefully assembled genealogical charts to colorful anecdotes passed down as private lore. A verifiable historical fact frames this chapter. In the mid-20th century. A few French and Swiss researchers, including Noël Corbu and Philippe de Chérizet, drew public attention to pedigrees claiming descent from the Merovingians. These pedigrees, whether accurate or not, relied on genuine medieval parish records, showing long continuity of certain southern French families. While no official record ties these lines to biblical ancestry, their documented roots in regions rich with Magdalene devotion, Provence, the Aude Valley, the Languedoc, lent their claims a romantic plausibility. An obscure and somewhat poignant example is the small French noble house of de Hautpoul de Blanchefort, connected historically to the very parish of Rennes-le-Château. Surviving baptismal and marriage registers trace this family well into the 17th century, and legends in the area link them without evidence to guardianship of a great secret inherited from Visigothic forebears. Folklorists note that similar whispers surround a few Catalan and Basque lineages, usually citing nothing more than oral tradition and symbolic motifs in heraldry. The open question that has frustrated professional historians is how to separate legitimate regional genealogy from stories grafted on by 20th-century popular writers influenced by the priory of Sion mythos. Serious archivists emphasize that while southern French pedigrees can be reconstructed with parish data back to the 15th century, the paper trail invariably dissolves in the upheavals of the early Middle Ages, leaving a 1,000-year gap impossible to bridge with certainty. Think back to the Fisher King's wound, the Sang-Riel pun, the Magdalene cult, and the black nobility's rumored Levantine ties. All these earlier motifs resurface here in the flesh and blood descendants, who inherit more legend than proof. For the most part, their claims serve as a mirror reflecting society's enduring hunger for continuity with the sacred narrative, a yearning as old as the Grail romances themselves. A brief moment of wry humor intrudes when you picture modern claimants standing in line at a local genealogy office with numbered tickets, hoping to prove what centuries of crusaders, popes, and scholars could not, that they carry royal blood of divine origin. The scene is more bureaucratic than beatific, yet it underscores how modern pursuits of ancestry have democratized what was once the province of kings. Despite advances in genetic testing, no laboratory has announced evidence linking any present-day individual or family to a first-century Judean household, let alone to Jesus of Nazareth. Even if ancient DNA from the period were recovered, ethical and theological questions would cloud its interpretation. Thus, today's claimants rest their case largely on interpretation of symbols, regional continuity, and faith in family legend. These contemporary heirs, whether sincere or sensational, represent the latest chapter in a continuum of speculation stretching from temple archives to papal bulls. Their stories remind us that the mystery has never been entirely about parchment or relics. It is also about human longing to belong to a story greater than oneself, a longing that has carried whispers of a sacred bloodline across 2 millennia. This sense of continuity, fragile yet persistent, prepares us for the closing act of our investigation, to pause, weigh the strands we have followed, prophetic texts, relics, art, sealed decrees, myths, science, and human testimony, and see whether together they form a plausible lineage or dissolve back into legend and light. The candle that has guided us through archives, chapels, legends, and laboratories now flickers low, casting long shadows across a table strewn with notes from every chapter we have crossed. Here at last we pause to examine the fragments not as scattered curiosities, but as pieces of a single mosaic. The question is whether, once assembled, these pieces reveal the outline of an enduring bloodline descended from the Messiah, or whether they remain a collage of coincidence, hope, and myth. One firm historical fact stands out from this journey. The earliest Christian centuries did recognize and even honor the Desposini relatives of Jesus through his family in Nazareth, as recorded by 2nd-century historian Hegesippus. These kinsmen reportedly led certain Judeo-Christian communities until at least the 2nd century. This confirms that Jesus had a known extended family whose lineage was regarded with respect in the early church. Yet no surviving source asserts that he fathered children, or that these relatives carried his direct bloodline forward. An obscure but intriguing pattern emerges when considering the convergence of southern French Magdalene traditions, Merovingian royal myths, and the recurring theme of a vessel symbolizing lineage. While each element can be explained by local folklore or medieval political propaganda, their persistence across geography and centuries hints at a shared cultural memory, perhaps no more than rumor, yet unusually durable for rumor alone. The open question remains whether the gaps in the record, the lost temple genealogies, the missing Templar archives, the sealed Vatican files conceal any text that could bridge early Judean kinship to later European dynasties. Until such a link appears in authenticated form, all modern reconstructions rest on circumstantial evidence and symbolic interpretation rather than demonstrable lineage. Think back to the Fisher King's wound that bled the land of fertility, the Grail as both cup and royal blood, the Magdalene cult enthroning her as apostolic witness, the papal decrees guarding certain genealogies under seal. Each thread on its own proves little. Together they weave a tapestry of cultural insistence that the sacred story continued in flesh, not merely in faith. Whether this insistence reflects history or longing is the crux that no scholar has resolved. A gentle touch of humor slips in when one imagines medieval knights, bishops, troubadours, archivists, geneticists, and present-day genealogy hobbyists, all standing in a single queue, each clutching their chosen proof, a sword, a scroll, a shard of bone, a DNA swab, hoping to be called next to the witness stand of history. The image feels oddly democratic, a reminder that the search itself has become part of our shared cultural inheritance. What can be said with confidence is that hints of a bloodline have persisted wherever memory met power in the politics of canon formation, in crusader relic hunts, in the heraldry of noble marriages, in regional devotion to a once marginalized female disciple. This persistence suggests not fabrication by any single hand, but a slow accretion of stories responding to a deep human desire to believe that the divine once left a trace in ordinary flesh, and that this trace endured. The mosaic we can assemble today is therefore partial and porous. It outlines a historical Jesus with relatives honored in the early church, a medieval Europe haunted by relics and legends of Magdalene's flight, a church often motivated to protect doctrinal unity by restricting destabilizing narratives, and a modern world that still seeks proof in chromosomes and parchments. Whether these pieces conceal a continuous family line or simply reflect humanity's need to tether faith to flesh remains unproven. With this weighing of fragments complete, the story yields to its closing breath a final benediction that slows the pulse and lets the listener drift from debate into reflection, where the mystery's unresolved beauty can rest without demand for verdict. Now let the lamps dim a little further. The ink on the parchments dries to a gentle sepia in the mind's eye. The echo of boots on temple stones, the hum of laboratory machines, the rustle of papal seals all begin to fade into a slower hush. Imagine the scattered fragments of legend settling like dust across an empty cathedral floor where moonlight spills in pale ribbons through the high windows. The story we have traced is neither proven nor fully dismissed. It lingers in a borderland between faith and scholarship, a testament to how deeply human beings long to believe that the divine once walked close enough to leave a living trace. Some pieces of that longing are real families in Nazareth known to the first believers, a woman from Magdala, who stood beside the cross and carried her witness across the sea archives, once kept beneath the stones of a vanished temple. Other pieces belong to the mist, the grail that shifts from cup to bloodline, the priory's secret dossiers, the whispered airs in French valleys. Set them all gently down now. Imagine each clue resting on the great wooden table of history, their edges worn and softened by centuries of telling and retelling. See the flicker of a final candle playing across them until even that flame grows small, its light shrinking to a single glowing thread that trembles, then steadies like the last heartbeat of a tale well told. If there is a lesson in this long search, it may be that mysteries sometimes endure, not because someone hides the answer, but because the question itself keeps us reaching toward meaning. A bloodline that cannot be traced still urges us to ask who we are and what we inherit, not merely by birth, but by story. Now take one slow breath in and let it out again. Picture the doors of the archive closing softly. The keys turn with a muted click. Outside, the night over Rome is cool and starlit. Somewhere in Provence, a bell on a hillside chapel rings once, then falls quiet. Let that sound drift away. Let the centuries themselves grow distant like waves receding across a dark shore. In this gentle quiet, the search for the lost bloodline of the Messiah finds its rest for tonight. May the unanswered questions remain as soft as the candle smoke that still hangs in the vaulted air, and may the listener carry into sleep the calm awareness that history's greatest secrets often lie not buried in vaults, but waiting in the hush between stories.